Hi, so we're going to look at doing some customer cohort analysis with Python. So we'll be able to look at customer retention. So what is a cohort? A cohort is just a customer segment. And that segment is usually defined by time, size, and behavior. And one of the most popular types of cohort analysis is using that time segment. So when we acquired the customer, what are the actions that are taken? Did we retain them? Was there churn? Size, we can look at spending, and behavior is what that cohort is doing at a certain point. So usually what we do is to visualize a cohort and understand this, we create a pivot table. But there are a few extra steps to get here. But this essentially is a heat map of a pivot table that we're going to create. The rows are the activity. The month of acquisition is also given there. Then on our columns, we have our retention, which is the month since acquisition. So to make it a little bit clearer, if we take a look and we try to understand, okay, in May 2011, that cohort, that time cohort, if we look at what happened 7 months later, we can still see that we have 27% of our customers still active 7 months since our May 2011 acquisition point. So we're going to code this all up, and we're going to essentially get down to a heat map here. So let's get started with a new notebook. So what we want to do is create a new Jupyter notebook here and start our coding. Now the first thing we want to do is bring in our data set, and let me just show you where our data set is coming from. So our data set is coming from an online retail data set. It has 54,000 rows, and we are going to access this data set and do some analysis of cohort. And you can see that this is from the UCI machine learning repository, and you can see it's perfect for classification and clustering, which fits nicely into our cohort analysis. And if you wanted to look at the columns here, it's everything, but we're going to do this all in our Jupyter notebook. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is read in our data set, and I'm going to make this a bit bigger with Control and plus. And first I'm going to import my library. So I'm going to document import libraries. And essentially, we're going to just use Python, Pandas, Seaborn, and Matplotlib. I don't think we'll need anything else, so let's import Pandas as PD. Let's import Matplotlib.pyplot as PLT, and let's import Seaborn as SNS. So that's all we need to get things started. And let's load in the data. Okay, so we're going to load in that repository. You can download it and save it into a section. I'm going to call mine, let's call it data. And I'm going to use the pandas variable PD to read in an Excel file. And then I am going to read in. So I've just read in the path here and use the variable data to look at info. And now what we can do, we can take a look at those columns. We can see we have an invoice number, stock code, description, quantity, invoice date, which is going to be one of our most important aspects, and then the customer ID, the unit price, and the country. So the first thing I want to do is take a look at the head, and I'm just documenting everything. So, and the head is going to give us the first 5 rows. So you can see the structure of the data. We have an invoice date, but this is broken down by time, so we're going to have to get just the date here for our purposes. Also, you can see that we have 541,000 rows. For our customer ID, you can see that we have 406,000. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop maybe anything that it doesn't have a customer ID. I'm going to create some spaces with escape and BB, rows with no customer ID. And so I'm just going to use the data variable again, and I'm going to say data.drop, drop in a, pass in subset equals for mine, and I'm going to pass in the column customer ID. And because we're going to have that saved over, because we are reassigning the variable there, so I'm just going to do data.info again, and we can see what we did wrong here. Make sure we put this in brackets, and then that will allow us to drop the customer ID. And you can see now we have all of the same numbers there. First, let's create a function to get the month. Now you could just use this date time variable and get the month, but just to give you an idea, create a function, because we can see here that this is a time, so we can get our information here for invoice month, and I want to be able to turn that into a cohort month. You could do date if you want and turn this into a date, but I don't want to look at things all the way down to the day level. I'm just going to get the month. So what I'm going to do is say, okay, create a month, and I'm going to say data, and then let's say invoice month. So it's the month that they actually got invoiced and not the actual date. And since this is a date time object, we can use, but let's create our function first so we can pass the function into this. What we're going to do, we're going to import date time, and we are going to create a function with def, and we're going to call it get_month. And then we just want to pass it in a column. We can use X as our placeholder. And then all we want to do is say return DT, which we need to return as DT. We want to use that date time variable to make it a little bit easier. Date time. And then we can turn this into a date time object to take elements out of it. So I'm going to take our X, and I want to get the year, and I want to get the month. And then for the day, I just want 1. So what's that going to do? It's going to allow us to take this all the way down to, okay, if we acquired the customer on a specific time, we're going to just look at the month and turn that into a date with the first day of the month as our section. So then now that I have this function, and let's document what we're doing. Function for month. So now I have the year, the month, and I'm just going to use 1 as a day. Now, since I have the function, I can use this invoice date and apply this function to it. So I'm going to isolate that with data and date, and then what I'm going to do is apply the function to that singular column, and I'm going to get month. And then let's take a look at the head of our data, and actually let's look at the tail and make sure we close this off. Data.tail, and if I run this, make sure we don't have any errors. So let's document, apply the function. We shift and enter, And we can see now, as you see on the 12th, on December 9th, 2011 at 12:50 p.m. or so, we've reduced that down to, okay, just give us the month, and then we have the month in the year, and we just passed in 1 there. So we're going to use this a little bit later to create the cohort month. So what we can do is create that cohort month based on the invoice month. So we're going to get the first month that we acquired the customer. So the first time we can see that customer ID in our data set. So let's do that. So we're going to, and let me make some space here with escape and BB. We're going to create a column index with the date, aka first time customer was acquired. So that's going to be our time cohort. And the way we can do that is, first we want to create that in that month. So we know we're using data as our data frame, and let's call it cohort month. So we're assigning the name of the column that we have here. And now we need to do like a group by. So we want to group by, and we want to group by our customer ID, because we want to know, we want to take all the customer IDs that are there and find out when it first appeared in our data set. So now we have that. We have our invoice month, so we can group by customer ID. We can take the invoice month, and from that invoice month, we want to be able to look at the first instance and apply it back to our customer ID. So we can do that by using a function called transform. So we want to transform this column and just return the minimum date that we can find there. And now that's going to be applied to cohort month. And let's take a look at our head of our data. And instead of looking at the first 5, let's look at the first 30 maybe. So I'm going to run that. And there's, let's run that now. Invoice month was spelled wrong. Voice, we got an extra in there, so let's run that. And don't worry about these warnings. So you can see here is our cohort invoice month, and this is our cohort month. So it looks like all of these will run on the same. So let's go back up and let's look at the tail of our data, and I'm going to run this. And now you can see that, okay, we have an invoice for 2011 December, but the first time this customer was acquired was back in May. So that's going to be one of our cohorts. We can see this customer has been in the system for even a year, 2010. So now we want to start taking the difference there and applying an index that we can look at. So now that we have an understanding of, okay, we want to be able to take the difference in these cohorts, let's create one more function where we can get the elements, because we want to be able to take the total time. So we need to look at the year and month, because if we know we have more than a certain time period, we want to be able to subtract and add them without adding a new column to the data frame, because we don't want to make the data frame wider, because it's going to take more space and be harder to process. So let's create a date element function to get a series for subtraction. Okay, and what does that mean? So let's take a look. We're going to create a function with def. Let's call it get date elements. And for this function, we won't apply it. We'll actually run it on our data frame. So let's pass in some variables. We could use x and y. Because I want to pass in the column and the data frame. So how about just calling it df and the column? We can initialize that function with our colon. So first I'm going to get the day variable, and what I'm going to do is use that data frame df, and then I'm going to get a column, which the column that we're going to apply this to is going to be our cohort month and our cohort month and our invoice month, so we don't have to do this twice. We can apply the function on both of those. So the day, and because it's a date time object, we can access dt, and then we can say give us the day. Now I just need to repeat this for our month. So I'm just going to copy and paste this, change this to month, and month. So now we have a variable called month, then copy and paste, and then get the year, and get the year here. So now we have a function, and what we want to be able to do is return all three of these variables, so we can use some subtraction. Return, and I'm going to say return day, month, and year. So now that we have that, we can run that. Now that function is saved into our environment. Now what I can do is I can take that function, so it's called get date elements, and this function we know is going to take two arguments, and you can see it here. It's going to take the two arguments, the data frame, which we know is called data in our example. And the column that we want to run this on first is going to be our invoice month column here. So I can take that now and pass that in. And that's our column. Now remember, this is going to return three elements. So we need to give those three elements names, and I'm going to call that invoice day, which I don't need. So I'm just going to call it underscore. And then for the second one, I want to call it invoice month, because I'm not concerned about the day, so that's why we don't have it. So invoice month, and then the last one would be invoice, let's say year. So now what we're going to have is those three elements. One's an underscore, one's going to be called invoice month, and invoice day. We need the underscore there because it's going to return three things, even though we don't need day because we're looking at the month level. And yes, we should actually talk about what we're going to do with a document string. Get date elements for our cohort and invoice columns. So I can take this same function here and just make another line here. And instead of invoice, we call this cohort. And we call this cohort. And then instead of this, we want to change this to our cohort month. And let's make sure we spelled it right, cohort month. So it's actually separated, cohort month instead of the particular no gap so if we run both of these, now we have those elements. So let's take one of these and see what it looks like. So if we take the invoice month, and let's say check the series, and the series only means it's a one-dimensional column. And if I run that, so there's a lot of them. We know that we have 541,000. So how about we just get the first 10 and let's take a look. So you can see that gives us the month. And if we change this to cohort, you can see we can also be able to see what's there. We change it to year. We also can see the year. And what we will be able to do is subtract these and get the difference. So we can add that cohort index. So now what we want to do is create an index. Create a cohort index. And that index is going to show us when the user was acquired. So we can find out how long they have been active and retained in our data. So the first thing we need to do is get the year difference. So we're going to call that year diff, and we can just say the invoice year, because invoice year is going to be the last time they were active minus the first time they were active, which is the cohort year. Then what we're going to do is get the month difference. And that's going to be the invoice month minus the cohort month. Now we know that the year, for example, if we acquired the customer in 2010 and it's 2011, the year is going to equal 1. That 1 is going to be equal to 12 months. So we need to come up with a calculation for that. So we know that if we get the year difference, we need to multiply it by 12, because if it's 1 year, we multiply it by 12. And then we need to add the months. So if it's 2011, so if we go back up to our example here and we see here, this would be a full year, so that would be 12 months. Now we want to get the months. So the months would just be adding the month difference. So if it's 6 months or 18 months, would be 12 months plus the 6. And now we want to add 1 to that. Because what about the customers that were acquired in, let's say they were acquired in the same month and year? This would only give us a 0. So if I go back up to the top here, I look at the head of the data instead of the tail. So we can see that this customer was acquired in the same month and also was only active for 1 month. So if we don't add a 1 to that, it's going to be 0. So let's add 1 to avoid that issue. And now that we have this calculation, we can add it back to our data frame. And we can call that cohort index. And we can save it. And of course, let's take a look at the head of our data to make sure that's all good to go. So now you can see that 0 is turned into 1 because we added this additional 1. If we look at the tail, you can see that this is going to be from this period to this period. It would be our 5 months from the month of acquisition to the 4th. So that's what that 1 is going to give us for the index. So 0 plus 1, 0 would be the month of acquisition. And if we add 1 to it, it'll be the first month of acquisition. And that's why this is 5 instead of 4. You can always eliminate that and you will get a 0, but I think it looks better with a 1. So I can add that, but it's optional, this particular part. Now that we have this, we need to create a pivot table. And the first part of creating that pivot table is to use a group by. So we want to be able to group by this cohort month and the cohort index and count each individual customer ID. So let's count the customer IDs. And let me change this to code. So count a customer ID by grouping by the customer, the cohort month, so we're going to know when they were acquired, and our index will help us know how long they've been in the system or how long they've been active, because we can see that is the 5 here or the 4 if you didn't add the 1. And the customer in the cohort index. So we can do just that. We're going to take our data and we're going to group by. Let's group by. Let's pass in a list. And we're going to group by our cohort month and our cohort index. Now that we have that, we can just say, give me the customer ID. And now what we want to be able to do is get the number of unique customer IDs. So we can do this in a couple different ways. We can do a function called none unique. And I'm just going to show you what that looks like. Let's see. Cohort index, I believe this needs to be together. So now let's see. You can see now that's there, or you can use a aggregation function and we can pass in pd.series.unique and we can run that. Oh, we need to actually apply that, not use aggregate. And you can see what we have there. You can have this particular part. But what do we need to add to that? You can see each individual one of our customer IDs, but we can add the in unique there. And we can run that. And you can see we get the same type of format. The reason to do it this way is because it's a little bit more reliable. So now that we have this, we can just save this as our cohort data. Save that as a variable we want. Now all we have to do is create a pivot table. So we can actually see that particular information. And one other thing here we need to do is, so if I look at cohort data here, you can see that the index is not in a table format. So the index is here as our cohort month. So when we create our pivot table, we'll have gaps. To eliminate that, we just put reset index. And now you can see now we have a regular table. Now I can create a pivot table, and I can just use the data frame cohort, and then use underscore data. And let me create some space here. And then we can use the pivot function. And that pivot function, we want to use the index. So remember, what we want to do is create our cohort month is going to be our index. And then the columns will equal our cohort index. And I can't remember if that is, yep, cohort index here. And then for our values, we want to use the customer ID, which is here. And then let's take a look at that. Let's see if there's any errors. Yes, there is. There is a indentation error. And then there's another one. Let's see what we did wrong here. Cohort index is one word. So now you can see we have our cohort table and the cohort index. We can already turn this into a visual if we want it by just passing in the heat map, and we can see the actual numbers of that users that are retained from each period. But it's better to turn this into, and then how long they are active within these 13 months here, or 12 months plus the 1. Remember, you can always use 0 if you prefer. And I'm just going to turn this into a heat map so we can take a look at it. So that's our cohort pivot. If I actually take this, I'm going to copy this and call this our cohort table. Underscore table equals, and let's just, so we can keep a look at it, just call the table again, cohort table. And you run that so we can see it again. Let's use our Seaborn variable. So let's visualize our results in a heat map. So we can just use sns.heatmap. And then what we can do is pass in our cohort table. And if we run that, let's just take a look. So you can see it's not the prettiest. You can see we have this index, which is not so pretty. We're going to fix that. Of course, we can add annotations and say true so we can see that actual number that we want to look at. So let's start fixing this up. So we say true, and it's still quite ugly. Of course, we can change the figure size with our matplotlib variable. So figure, and we say fig size equals, and then maybe we pass in the size that we want, and let's say 2110 maybe would be very big. If I pass this in, you can see now we're starting to kind of get a better look at a pivot table. But you can see what happens is it's still not in the percentages, but we're going to keep building. So let's fix our index. Don't like the way that index looks. So what we can do is change the index, and I'm just going to put it here, change index. And what I'm going to do is get our cohort table, and then I'm going to isolate the index, and then in that index I'm going to resave the cohort But instead of this date time object, I'm going to save it as a string. So what I can do is I can say, okay, give me the cohort table, and I want to take the index, and then I want to change that index to a string time using this function strf time, and then I'm going to pass in this particular symbol. So B would be the month, and then Y would be the year. And if I run that now, let's see what happened. Cohort, I spelled cohort wrong. Cohort, not cohort, cohort table. And if I run this now, now you can see we've been able to fix that index by adding that time in to just give me the month and the year. And you could use this. However, we want to be able to change this into a percentage. And also we can look at changing the color. Just so we want CMAP equals blues. And oops, and I wrote it in the wrong place. This should not be here, so I'm going to eliminate that. This needs to be in the heat map because that's the visual. And if I rerun that and get rid of one of the commas, and what did I do wrong? Oh, so now we've already run this, so it's probably better to have this on a separate line. So I'm going to run that now, because if we rerun it again, it's no longer a date time object, so this is no longer active. So now we have this, and now let's divide this so we get that traditional cohort look. Take this particular part of our function, so let's make some space, and let's say create parentheses percentages. Oops, and I actually want to copy all of this. Control C, and so what we want to do is create our percentage table. So what we can do, we can run it all in our particular. But what we want to do is be able to get our cohort table. And let me just create a space above just to show you. Escape and A. So let's say we want to get the cohort table. A cohort table there. And we want to be able to divide. So I'm going to use divide. And you can see that as a data frame variable. I'm going to divide each one of these by the first row. So this is going to be your total. And then we want to be able to divide this total by this row. So I am going to divide the cohort table. And I want to just isolate this part, which is the first part, and that first part is going to be isolated with iloc. So I can take iloc here and say, give me all of the columns, all of the rows. So I want all of the rows, and this is signified here, but I just want the first column, which is 0. And then I want it to divide by row. So I need to say axis equals 0. And let's run that. and I'll show you. So now you can see what happens is we've taken the cohort table, which was here, and then we've divided by the first element in each row, which we use with iLock and Access. And now what we have is these percentages, and you can see that that is there. We can resave that. So cohort, I'm going to call it cohort table for percentage. And then what we can do is now we can call this our new, let's call that new cohort table. And I'm going to save that over. And I'm just going to recall that so we can just see it. So now the same thing. And all I need to do is pass this in to our new cohort table as our data here. And let me make some space with Escape BB. Create a percentage visual. And let's run this. Okay, we have an error. Oh, just a spelling error. Let's add the E to table. And this should, okay, so it works. However, we still don't have our percentages, but we can use that with the format argument within our heat map and say we want to be able to pass in a percentage like this, but we only want maybe, I don't want any zeros behind my particular percentage. So this is going to be our format. And if I run that, now you have that cohort table. And now we can see, if we wanted to see what the retention was, we can definitely change this blues to, you know, different color maps. Magma is that one. You can see December has a outlier, which 50% are still active at the year, almost the year mark. We can change this to cool warm. And we can see, okay, we had 100% there with the red, and then we can see when users were active. If you actually remove this part, it's also quite easy to see. With no color maps, we can also see when things were active. So what you would want to do is evaluate each one of these months. Maybe there was a marketing action, and see if we were able to still retain customers. Because you can see there's some significant drop off in March 2011, where only the customers weren't that active during that month. So maybe there's some element of the product and the time that we can evaluate to see if customers are still active after a certain period of time. I hope that helps.